For people that are maybe where you were, struggling to be more authentic in their social work practice, do you have any advice that you would like to give them? Maybe some concrete steps or actions that they can take as well, like small steps, if even if that's
Yeah,
helpful.
yeah, for sure. I think that first of all, what I want to say is that it's very, um, I think that it's always an asset in this field when folks are coming to the work, from different lived experiences. And that can like be so vast and so many. And I think for me, when I think about anybody who might be experiencing some challenges in showing up as their authentic selves, it's just to acknowledge the circumstances under which you have to show up for as your authentic self. So again, I speak a lot from my perspective as like a Black transgender person, right? A lot of the things that I struggle with are rooted in systems and institutions that don't necessarily are rooted in an individual, but again, in systems and institutions, these are things that are really hard and slow to change. And so for me, just that acknowledgement and recognizing that it is ideal that I do show up as my authentic self, but what are the circumstances that make it hard for me to show up as my authentic self, especially in comparison to maybe some folks where you're just watching them just like excel and flourish, and maybe they're not experiencing a lot of pushback or consequence from being their authentic self, right? So just thinking about the circumstances under which we have to work, just kind of like acknowledging that and naming that, I think is first. And then I think a lot about folks continuing to explore and think about doing this work and how it makes you feel, and why you want to keep doing this work, right? Just kind of like that self-reflection around like why you're here, why you want to do it, who you're doing it for is super important in being authentic. And I think that those questions can be asked at different periods of your journey through your career and through the field. So it's not something that you only have to ask yourself like straight at the beginning of like when you're kind of like starting the work. I think it's a question that periodically there should be moments of reflection around like why you're here, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. I think too, when I think about authenticity, I think a lot about how, not to open another can of worms,
Go ahead, go
but
open the can.
I think a lot about how I definitely have colleagues who are burnt out, but who are not being authentic in that, who are really pushing through the burnout for very valid reasons. They're continuing to do the work. They're getting support for themselves, but they're burnt out, right? And I think that's a huge reality for a lot of folks in the field. If you're struggling to be authentic, recognize, like, are you feeling burnt out? Do you need a break? And, if those things are true, being a part of being authentic is learning and knowing when to take a break, and sort of like knowing, when it's time to create space for others to step up and maybe do that work from a different perspective too.
That's a great way to think about it with burnout, like
Yeah,
not even just a lived experience from your past, but also what you're experiencing right now, right? That's
exactly.
great.
Exactly. I always think about, for myself, showing up as my authentic self means that, some of the statistics that I see about Black folks, about trans folks, I'm not exclusive from those statistics. So if 2021 was the deadliest year on record for trans folks, like that statistic, I'm not removed from that statistic, right? And so I think a part of being authentic too is recognizing that depending on where you're coming from and how you're approaching the work, some of the things that we're supporting folks around, we also need support around. We're not kind of removed from those narratives around oppression and how that can manifest. Always just kind of like being mindful of that and knowing that oftentimes there's like a power balance that exists when we think about like the social worker and the client or the service user, right? But it's really important to acknowledge that sometimes the social worker, their experience is not far off from the quote unquote client. So like recognizing and rooting yourself in that and knowing that that's what you're working from, for sure. I can add a few more things as well
Oh,
on some
sure.
some stuff about advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've just been kind of thinking as well. And I think for me, when folks are accessing support, so like when folks in the field are accessing support, as much as you can, things like therapy, supervision, get that from folks who come from your experience, who look like you. It's been challenging for me to find like a Black transgender person where I can access like peer-to-peer support or supervision. But when I have access to that kind of support, I noticed how helpful it was to, talk through some challenging times and issues that I was kind of like dealing with, and talking to somebody who might get it a bit more was always helpful.
Do
Yeah.
you think that helped you do better work or be more authentic in your work with
Yes,
clients?
absolutely. especially the role of like a therapist or a clinical supervisor. Knowing somebody who looks like me, has, worked in this capacity for many years before I did, just gave me so much confidence to know that, like, I'm approaching this well, is what I'm doing okay, and that I could actually like make and carve a way for myself in the field, for sure. I know in one of my workplaces, what was really helpful for me is like forming a peer group. We were a group of like people of color who are also mostly queer and trans, and we just formed an informal like lunch group where we kind of like got together and chatted and like talked about the work and like what we're up to in life. And, in an agency where we were like one of the 5 or 6 folks who looked like us, it was really helpful to have that space, right? And then when we are not in that space, we can just know who to call to for support, who our peers were. So yeah, just really carving out your space in that workplace if you can, and finding the support internally and externally, I think can really help in being your authentic self.
And then when you go back to work, even if they're not there with you, it still feels like you're less alone, right?
Exactly.
Is there anything else you want to say?
I want to name how it's important to show up as your authentic self, because like you mentioned, like folks can tell, when we're not. But I also think it's not always easy to do so. And I want to name that. And so I'm encouraging folks to show up as their authentic selves, but I'm also encouraging folks to like have boundaries, do things that feel good for you. And also like remember that you matter in this work. You're important to this work. And the fact that you want to do this like means something. And so just always taking time to like investigate that and show up for yourself as much as you can. Showing up for others means that you have to show up for yourself as much as you do others. So
Can you elaborate a little on showing up for yourself?
yeah, I think showing up for yourself can be very deep, but like it also can be doing something like journaling, going for walks, making sure you're eating your meals and you're taking meal breaks, accessing therapy. Again, if therapy's not your jam, accessing whatever form of support would feel good for you to keep going, and keep balanced and keep kind of like grounded in the work. Supervision, peer groups, whatever you would need, all the work that we do in supporting others, we should be doing as much work on ourselves too. As hard as that could be sometimes, it's so important in order for us to kind of like show up, for others. I don't know about you, but like I have so many friends where, and myself included, where that's not the first thing I'm always thinking about. Like I'm very bad at self-care, but I also have learned through my experience how important it is, to like do things like address burnout, and to like think about like sustainability in the work, for sure.